For my second case study, we looked at a very limited study showing some aortic stenosis. The patient is a male, 64 years old, 6 feet tall, 250 pounds. As opposed to the last patient, this patient was a very large man. And because he was so large, the study was very limited due to his body habitus. The reasons for the echo were they noticed a murmur, aortic stenosis, shortness of breath, and hypertension. On initial observations of the parasternal lung, and again, these should be videos, but they are only popping up as still images. But we can see there's no pericardial effusion, limited motion of the aortic valve leaflets, left ventricular hypertrophy, and an enlarged left atrium. When we do M mode, we see that our findings show the aortic diameter is a little bit large. We have a mildly enlarged left atrium and limited motion of the aortic valve leaflets. The aortic root was measured by itself. Normal is 2 to 3.7, and that root measured 2.2. So that gives us an LVOT area of about 3.76 centimeters squared. When we get to the left ventricle measurements, IVSD was 1.5, posterior wall was 1.4. Both of these indicate symmetrical left ventricular hypertrophy. And we can also see the left ventricle diameter during diastole was 4.3, which is normal. But the report listed this as an enlarged left ventricle. Moving on, we got our ejection fraction at about 50% here. When we put color on, we can see a little trace MR. Again, horrible pictures, but when you play the video, you can actually see the concentric flexing of the left ventricular muscles at the papillary level, indicating that there's no prior infarct. The mitral valve shows mitral valve function in that little MR. Hang on here. Actually, when we go to the aorta, we can see there's no aortic insufficiency. There's no pulmonary insufficiency. The pulmonary artery velocity is 0.82 meters per second, which means our pulmonary pressure gradient is 2.7 millimeters of mercury. We can see a little trace TR. The apical 4 view shows the left ventricle and mitral valve function, and the report listed trace calcification on the mitral valve. I had trouble seeing this. I believe that was in the report because it was on there from the prior. You can see a little bit of calcification, but it's really hard to determine. The left atrium was 4.2 centimeters, and anything under 4.5 is considered normal. For some reason, this 4.2 was listed as mildly enlarged. We can see in apical 4, we can see the MR jet was listed as trace, although I have trouble seeing the jet. So either the jet was there and the sonographer didn't take a very good video, or maybe I'm just not seeing it in that video. On the mitral valve pulse wave, we get an E to A ratio of 0.89, which is normal. We're going to call that normal. Well, it's actually on the border of diastolic dysfunction. So we'll call it diastolic dysfunction. It is just over threshold. On the ED prime values for the tissue Doppler, we saw, again, diastolic dysfunction based on those ED prime values. You can, in apical 4 and 5, you can also see a little trace tricuspid regurg. The trace tricuspid regurg comes out to 1.24 meters per second. Adding 10 gives us 16.2 millimeters of mercury. On this view, you can see a little bit of the aortic stenosis and the aortic annulus calcification. Both were noted on the report. So to do the LVOT, we trace the jet here, which gives us 0.97 meters per second, and the gradient is 3.8. Now, when we do the aorta, we trace it as well. And this gives us a velocity of 2.5, and the pressure is 25 millimeters of mercury. This indicates the difference between the two, indicates that there is moderate stenosis. because the LVOT and the aorta show different pressures. They should have the same pressure, same velocity, but we calculate our valve area to be 1.62 centimeters squared. Here's the actual report, and that's it. Thank you for joining me.